In 1919, a woman inherited one of the largest sums ever built by a black woman in America, a hair care company worth over $1 million, a mansion on the Hudson River, 2 houses in Harlem. She was 34 years old, and by inheritance alone, one of the wealthiest black women alive. 12 years later, movers were carrying the furniture out of that same mansion to help cover the bills, and 11,000 people were lining up in the August heat to see her body. Her name was Alelia Walker. In between, she threw the most legendary parties in Harlem's history. And Harlem never fully decided whether to call her a queen or a warning. This is the story of what her mother's money was supposed to buy her, what she spent it on instead, and what that cost her. Before there was wealth to spend, there was a woman who earned it $1.50 at a time. She was born Sarah Breedlove on a cotton plantation in Louisiana, the first of her parents' children born free, the ones before her having been born enslaved. Orphaned by the time she was 7, she went to work in the cotton fields alongside an older sister, and at 14 she married, largely to escape a brother-in-law she later described as abusive. She was a mother by 17 and a widow by 20 when her husband, Moses McWilliams, died and left her alone with an infant daughter and almost nothing else. In the 1890s, in St. Louis, that widow took in washing. Her days ran the same shape for years: cold water, harsh soap, other families' linens hung to dry in whatever light a rented room allowed, the work that paid for rent and school fees and little else. She raised her daughter alone through all of it. Her husband dead, her own hair falling out in patches from a scalp condition common among black women who worked with lye soap and little else. Her name, at the time, was still Sarah. The name the world would come to know her by, Madame C.J. Walker, came later, attached to a hair care formula, a national sales force, and eventually a business empire that made her, by most accounts, the first self-made woman millionaire in the United States, black or white, a claim later formalized by the Guinness Book of World Records. Not the richest woman in America, but the first to build a sum of that size from nothing, without inheriting it, and without marrying it. What made that wealth acceptable, in the eyes of black America and white America both, was the story of how she got it. She had scrubbed floors before she built something from nothing. The popular version of her story often gets one detail wrong. She did not invent a hair-straightening process, whatever the legend claims. What she developed and sold was a scalp treatment system, aimed at the hygiene and disease that caused hair loss in the first place, a distinction her own family has spent decades correcting in public. Every dollar of it could be traced back to a bottle sold, a scalp treated, a sales agent trained across a territory that would eventually stretch from Denver to Pittsburgh to Indianapolis, where the company found its permanent headquarters in 1910. Newspapers, churches, and civic leaders praised her as a racewoman, a phrase that meant something specific in 1910, a woman whose success reflected credit on every black person watching, precisely because it had been earned in full view through visible labor, structure, and discipline. That image did not build itself. Both women in this story courted the black press deliberately, feeding it stories, granting it access, shaping the record even as the record shaped them back. The reputation this whole story turns on, in other words, was never neutral to begin with. She backed that image with real money spent in public. Tuition covered for 6 students at Tuskegee Institute, $5,000 donated to the anti-lynching campaign of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and quiet support for the silent protest parade of 1917, a march of thousands down Fifth Avenue against racial violence. Every gift was documented, every dollar traceable, every act of generosity another line in the ledger of a life that had, by then, nothing left to prove and proved it anyway. That last part mattered more than anyone said out loud. A black woman's wealth in this era was never allowed to simply exist. It had to justify itself constantly against a country built on the opposite assumption. Work was the justification. Spend without having worked for it first, And the same country that praised Madame Walker would reach for another word entirely. Her only surviving child did not build the company. She inherited it. Lelia, later Alelia, grew up inside the business from girlhood, running errands, then branch offices, then departments, but she was never its founder, and founders and heirs are rarely judged by the same rule, even when they are mother and daughter. The daughter would spend the rest of her life discovering exactly how different those two judgments could be. In 1919, the woman who had written that rule died. She left behind a company, a personal estate that put her among the wealthiest women in the country, regardless of race, a house on the Hudson 34 rooms deep, real estate in Harlem, and a single heir with no template for holding all of it without breaking the rule that had made it respectable in the first place. Nobody handed the daughter a manual for how to be rich without also being suspect. She would have to write her own, in public, one party at a time, and Harlem would grade every page of it. That heir was about to find out the hard way, and the first lesson would arrive within days of the funeral, dressed as a wedding. She was born Lelia McWilliams in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and lost her father before she was old enough to remember his voice. One account, impossible to confirm with certainty, ties his death to a race riot in the town where they lived. The sources that mention it say so cautiously, and the record does not settle the question either way. Her mother's own romantic history was hardly steadier than the one her daughter would later be criticized for. She married John Davis in 1894 and divorced him in 1903. She married Charles Joseph Walker in 1906. It was from that third marriage that the daughter took the surname that made her famous, Walker, a name she wore for the rest of her life without ever being legally adopted by the man who gave it to her. 3 marriages in the mother's past. 3 more waiting in the daughter's future. The pattern repeated almost exactly, generation to generation, though history would remember only one of the 2 women for it. She studied at Knoxville College in Tennessee, then went to work for her mother's growing company, first in Pittsburgh, where she managed a branch office and oversaw a beauty school named, in her honor, the Lelia College. Her role went further than administration. Family accounts describe her as instrumental in the design and decoration of the Walker salons themselves, choosing furnishings and layouts that could rival any high-end beauty parlor in the country, a skill for atmosphere and presentation that would later define her parties far more visibly than it ever defined her business career. For a full decade, from 1908 to 1918, she was less a socialite than a working manager, learning the mechanics of a national sales operation built almost entirely on black women selling to other black women door to door, town to town, ledger to ledger. Her great-granddaughter, decades later, would describe the relationship between mother and daughter in 2 words: fire and ice. They loved each other with real intensity and fought just as hard, in a dynamic her biographer has compared to codependency. Shaped by hardship, both women had lived through long before either had money. The mother brought the drive of someone who had built an empire from $1.50 a day. She expected the same intensity from her daughter, not always pausing to ask whether her daughter wanted it. Her daughter was a different kind of person. Where the mother saw a company to be run with total focus, the daughter saw a life to be lived, and she wanted both, the family business and a world beyond it, at the same time. She married for the first time around 1911 to a hotel waiter named John Robinson. The marriage did not last. They separated within a few years and divorced formally in 1914, and the sources say little else about it. No courtship, no scandal, nothing beyond the bare dates. Whatever happened between them, it left no visible mark on the life that followed. And by the time Alelia's name became a fixture in Harlem's papers a decade later, almost no one thought to ask about the first husband at all. A small mercy, the record rarely extended to the marriages that came after it. In 1913, she persuaded her mother to open an office and a beauty school in Harlem, a neighborhood just beginning to fill with black families arriving from the South. On paper, it was a business decision, a new market to reach. It would turn out to be the decision that placed her permanently at the center of the most consequential black cultural movement of the 20th century, though nobody standing in that office in 1913 could have known it yet. 6 years later, the woman who had built the whole operation, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, would be gone. The daughter who had learned the business without ever quite escaping her mother's shadow would inherit everything at once: the company, the houses, the name, and the unspoken rule that came bundled with all three, whether she had asked for it or not. On the 25th of May, 1919, Madam C.J. Walker died at her Hudson River estate, and her daughter was not there. She was on a business trip to Panama, traveling home when the news reached her, and by the time she stepped off the ship in New York, she was no longer simply an employee of the family company. She was its president at 34 years old and the sole heir to an estate whose combined personal and business value across the sources that tracked it came to well over $1 million. Grief and inheritance arrived together, and she answered both within days by getting married again, this time to a doctor named Wiley Wilson, in a ceremony that left almost no time between the funeral and the wedding for anyone in the family to ask whether the timing made sense, or whether grief was doing the deciding. According to her own biographer, it was not the marriage her heart was actually in. Of the two physicians who would pass through her life in this period, it was the other one, a man named James Arthur Kennedy, whom she genuinely trusted. Wilson, she distrusted almost from the start. Why she married him first so soon after her mother's funeral is a question the sources do not answer. What they do show is a pattern that would repeat across the next decade. Decisions made quickly, in the immediate wake of loss, that would not hold. The actual running of the company never depended on her presence in Indianapolis. That work belonged to Freeman B. Ransom, the general manager, and Alice Kelly, who oversaw the factory floor, a structure that had existed even while her mother was alive and continued, largely unchanged, after she died. Alelia was the public face of the Walker Company, the name on the letterhead, and the woman in the photographs. Ransom and Kelly were its hands, its ledgers, its supply orders, the machinery nobody outside Indianapolis ever saw. That division mattered more than anyone realized in 1919. From the very first year of her inheritance, Alelia Walker held a title and a bank account without holding the daily machinery that produced either. She was president of a company she did not run, widow of nobody, and heir to everyone's expectations. And for the first time in her adult life, the money in front of her belonged to no one but herself. She was, by then, the only surviving child of the marriage that had made her, the last Walker left standing between a company worth millions and a country that expected her to prove she deserved it. She did not go back to Pittsburgh, nor did she sit quietly with the grief. There was, in 1919, no older sibling to share the weight of the name, no other Walker left to consult before a decision was made public. Whatever she did next, she would do as the only person left holding the family's whole reputation at once. Within 2 years, she would do something almost no woman of her era did, black or white, leave the country alone for months in search of a version of the world that had nothing to do with hair pomade or sales figures at all. In 1921, Alelia Walker boarded a ship for Europe by herself and stayed away for 5 months. There was no company matter drawing her across the Atlantic this time, no branch office to inspect, no sales convention to preside over. For the first time since she had taken over the presidency, the trip existed for no reason beyond her own curiosity, paid for entirely out of money that answered to nobody. She settled first into a luxury hotel on the Champs-Élysées, within sight of the Arc de Triomphe, and spent her Paris evenings in the company of the couturier Paul Poiret, the singer Mistinguett, the jazz drummer Louis Mitchell and his wife Antoinette, and an actor named Dooley Wilson, a man who would not become famous for another 2 decades when he sang a song called As Time Goes By in a film called Casablanca. None of them knew yet what they would become. In 1921, they were simply the company she kept in Paris, at a moment when very few black American women crossed the Atlantic at all, let alone by themselves. From Paris, the itinerary widened. Nice, Monte Carlo, Naples, Rome, then east, toward Cairo and Jerusalem, cities most of her Harlem neighbors would only ever see printed on a postcard. From there, she continued through the Suez Canal, across the Red Sea, to the port of Djibouti, then inland by rail, on a modern line the French had built with the permission of the Ethiopian crown, towards the capital, Addis Ababa. In March of 1922, she was received by the Empress of Ethiopia, Sauditu, becoming one of only a small handful of Westerners, and fewer still Black Americans, ever to meet the Empress in person. From there, the journey turned back north through London before finally closing the loop toward home. It is worth pausing on what the Ethiopian leg of that trip meant, and why she likely made it at all. To a certain generation of Black American intellectuals in this period, Ethiopia carried weight far beyond geography. It was one of the only nations on the African continent never colonized by a European power, a fact that made it, in the writing and speeches of the time, a living symbol that Black sovereignty was not merely a historical memory, but a present reality, somewhere in the world. A visit to its empress was not simply the itinerary of a wealthy tourist. For a woman raised inside the politics of Black American respectability, it was closer to a pilgrimage, an act that placed her, deliberately or not, inside a larger political imagination than the ballrooms of Harlem had ever offered her. She returned to New York in 1922, a changed woman, at least in name. It was around this time that she formally adopted the name the world would remember her by, adding an apostrophe and a syllable to the name her mother had given her. No longer simply Lelia Walker, but Alalia. The empire she came home to build would not be a company, and it would not be a nation. It would be a room. By the mid-1920s, Alelia Walker was keeping 3 residences at once. The Hudson River mansion her mother had built, a townhouse in Harlem on West 136th Street, and a smaller apartment on Edgecombe Avenue for evenings that called for less formality. The mansion had been designed by Vertner Tandy, the first Black architect registered in the state of New York and a co-founder of the fraternity Alpha Phi Alpha, whose commission drew press coverage under headlines like "Wealthiest Negro Woman's Suburban Mansion When Construction Began in 1917, coverage that treated a Black family's real estate as a novelty worth reporting on the same terms as a circus act. The white residents of Irvington, according to that same era of reporting, were reportedly horrified when they learned who was building on the hill above them, a reaction that had nothing to do with the size of the house and everything to do with the color of the family moving into it. Opera singer Enrico Caruso, an early guest at the finished house, was so struck by its resemblance to villas in his native Italy that he coined its name on the spot, taking the first 2 letters of each word in her full name, Lelia Walker Robinson, and stitching them together. Villa Lewaro. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, favoured a signature turban, and by every account spared no expense on either her wardrobe or her guest lists, arriving at her own parties dressed as deliberately as any of the artists she had invited to perform there. Langston Hughes, who saw her hold court more times than almost anyone else outside her own family, once described her simply as a gorgeous dark Amazon. At Villa Lewaro, Black servants dressed in white powdered wigs, a costume borrowed wholesale from 18th century European households, served cocktails and canapes to guests lounging on imported furniture, an image so layered with irony that even her contemporaries noticed it. In November of 1923, she staged the wedding of her adopted daughter May to a doctor named Gordon Jackson, sending 9,000 invitations to Walker Company sales agents across every American state and to addresses in Nigeria, Liberia, England, France, Haiti, and Panama, an invitation list that traced, almost perfectly, the same sales territory her mother had spent 2 decades building one agent at a time. Newspapers dubbed it the $1 million wedding. The real cost, by the most reliable accounting available, was closer to $40,000, itself no small sum, worth over $700,000 today, but a fraction of the figure the press preferred to print. It would not be the last time a number attached to her name grew larger with every retelling than the number that had actually appeared on a receipt. Her philanthropy, largely overshadowed by her parties even at the time, followed the same pattern her mother had set. She led fundraising drives for an ambulance to serve black soldiers during the First World War and funded a building for the Utopia Neighborhood Club's Child Welfare and Recreation Center in Harlem, a modest project in 1920 terms that would, decades after her death, serve as the New York headquarters for the March on Washington in 1963, a use for the building no one at its opening could have imagined. In 1927, she and a walker, trained beautician named Lucille Randolph, wife of the labor organizer A. Philip Randolph, founded the Harlem Debutantes Club, a social service project meant to involve young women of the community, May included, in charitable work, the kind of quiet, structured generosity that rarely made the same headlines as a party but ran, year after year, in the background of her public life anyway. The Harlem townhouse itself had already begun renting space for weddings, sorority functions, and art shows a few years earlier, under the name the Walker Studio, before Alelia converted a full floor of it, that October, into a private club she called the Dark Tower, naming it after a poem and a column written by the poet County Cullen. She hired the Austrian designer Paul Frankel to furnish the space, and his centerpiece, a bookcase built in the shape of a modern skyscraper, became the room's unofficial emblem, printed across its stationery and its invitations, a piece of furniture ambitious enough that visitors sometimes mentioned it before they mentioned the guests. Gold-coloured walls held the room together. Velvet upholstery covered nearly every surface meant to be sat on. A sky-blue Victrola stood in one corner and a rose-coloured piano in another, and even the napkins were printed with the name of the space itself, so that no detail, however small, went unbranded. The guest list, across both the townhouse and the mansion, reads today like a partial index of the era itself. Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, the singer Alberta Hunter, the critic and hostess Muriel Draper, the singer Nora Holt, the poet Witter Binner, the entertainer Taylor Gordon, the songwriter Andy Razaf, the attorney Clarence Darrow, moving through the same rooms on the same nights, editors beside dancers, uptown regulars beside downtown visitors who had crossed the park specifically for an invitation with her name on it. The guest most likely to capture the effect she had on all of them was not a rival, but an admirer. A composer named Max Ewing wrote, in a letter dated April of 1929, that any other invitation had to be cancelled the moment one arrived from Malalia, and he called her, without irony, the great Black Empress, she who must be obeyed. Contemporaries who watched her work, a room noticed something else too. She rarely inserted herself into its centre. She had the invitation sent, made sure the bottles were uncorked, mingled briefly with her guests, and then withdrew, often to a card table, leaving the rest of the evening to the people she had assembled around her. By every visible measure, she had built the thing her mother never had time to build, a space entirely her own, filled with the most consequential artists and intellectuals of her generation, run on her terms, in rooms she had paid for herself. Not everyone in Harlem agreed that she had earned the right to decide who belonged in them. The judgment aimed at Alelia Walker did not come only from outside the black community. Some of the sharpest of it came from inside her own social class. An academic study of the family, published decades later in a journal of women's history, traced the mechanism directly. The same black press that had spent years building Madame Walker's image as a racewoman, a woman whose success was earned and therefore safe to celebrate, turned that exact language against her daughter, treating visible spending as evidence of a character flaw the mother had somehow never passed on to her. The study takes its title from Alelia's own words, a line she once used to explain herself. I try to live somewhat in keeping with my reputation as a wealthy woman. It reads almost like a legal defense, an air explaining that spending, too, could be its own kind of obligation. Part of Harlem's upper stratum, particularly its lighter-skinned elite, never fully accepted her, dismissing her in private. As the daughter of a washerwoman, regardless of how large her bank account had grown. Behind her back, some of them used a nickname dripping with condescension, calling her and women like her the mahogany millionaires, a phrase that folded two separate judgments, one about class and one about the color of her skin, into a single insult. Grace Nail Johnson, wife of the writer James Weldon Johnson and widely regarded as the reigning grand dame of Harlem's social establishment, made her opinion a matter of public record in the most direct way available to her. She refused, on principle, ever to cross the threshold of any house Alelia owned, the Dark Tower included. At the same time, Alelia was building something Harlem's more conservative circles found even harder to forgive than her bloodline, a room where nobody had to pretend to be someone else, a dancer of the era named Mabel Hampton, who would go on to help found one of the country's first archives dedicated to lesbian history, remembered the crowd at those parties in an oral history recorded decades later, describing men and women, women and women, and every combination between, sharing the same floor without concealment, at a moment when almost no public space in America offered that freedom to anyone, let alone to black queer Harlemites. Alelia's parties did, whether or not that had ever been the stated purpose. A historian studying the era later summarized the asymmetry in a single line. The mother had been required to be visible in her labor, and the daughter was punished for the same visibility, applied instead to pleasure. A television production decades later would get the shape of this almost exactly backward. A limited series inspired by her mother's life, released in the spring of 2020, invented a fictional lover for Alelia, a hairdresser named Esther, and staged a hidden, forbidden romance between them, the kind of secret the show implied she spent years concealing from everyone around her. Her own biographer, watching the finished product, pointed out what the invented subplot got wrong. There was no evidence of any such romance, no Esther in any record, primary or otherwise. What the record shows instead is not a secret Alelia was hiding, but an openness she was hosting, deliberately, for other people, in rooms with her own name on the lease. The truth was less dramatic than the fiction, and more interesting. She built the shelter. She never needed to be the one hiding inside it. So the same rooms that made her a legend to Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and half of Harlem's most talented generation made her something closer, to an embarrassment to another part of that same Harlem, a woman too dark-skinned for the faction that judged by complexion, and too permissive for the faction that judged by conduct. No amount of money, however large, could buy her out of either judgment. She built the most open room in Harlem. The most respected woman in the neighborhood never once walked through its door. Among the white guests who moved easily through Alelia's rooms, few were more constant or more consequential than the critic and photographer Carl Van Vechten. He had started his career as a music critic at the New York Times, then as its Paris correspondent, before turning to fiction in his 40s. By the time he became a fixture at Alelia's parties, he had already published several novels about bohemian life downtown, and he described his growing fascination with Harlem in a letter to a friend by saying he had passed practically my whole winter in company with Negroes and had succeeded in getting into most of the important social circles he could find. Van Vechten had spent years cultivating friendships across Harlem's literary and artistic circles, positioning himself deliberately as an insider in a world he had been born entirely outside of, a status he claimed for himself and never stopped claiming. In October of 1926, that cultivation produced a novel, its title built around a racial slur, marketed as a portrait of Harlem's nightlife for a white reading public hungry for exactly that kind of material. The reaction was immediate and, in places, furious. W.E.B. Du Bois, editor of the NAACP's magazine, publicly recommended the book be burned. The poet County Cullen, one of Van Vechten's own close friends, was reportedly white with rage when he learned of the title. In Harlem itself, residents strung an effigy of Van Vechten from a lamppost near the corner of 135th Street and 7th Avenue, a public act of protest just blocks from the townhouse where Alelia had hosted the man at the center of it more than once. She never publicly severed the friendship. What the record does not show is what it cost her privately to keep it. Being the bridge between Harlem and downtown had given Alelia real advantages, access to white editors and publishers, and the kind of press coverage that turned a private party into a national reputation. That same bridge now carried real risk. Every black host who kept a controversial white friend close in this period risked being seen as complicit in whatever that friend did next. And Alelia, more visibly than almost anyone else in Harlem, had built her entire social identity on being exactly that kind of host. The one who let both worlds sit in the same room. Harlem, in time, largely forgave Van Vechten, or at least stopped hanging him in effigy, and he would go on, decades later, to become one of the era's most important archivists, donating his own photographs and papers to universities, effectively appointing himself the keeper of a Renaissance he had once nearly discredited by association. But 1926 marked something quieter and more permanent. The first year in which the room Alelia had built to be entirely her own briefly became, through no fault of her own hosting, a liability. It would not be the last liability the decade handed her. The exact month the parties ended is something the sources never quite settle. There is a certain symmetry in what came next, even if nobody living through it could have seen it that way. The same rule that had shaped Alelia's entire adult life, the rule that money not visibly earned would eventually be called into question, was now closing back in on her from an angle nobody had predicted. Not moral judgment this time, but simple economics. The Depression did not care whether wealth had been built by a mother's labour or spent by a daughter's hospitality. It came for both versions of the story at once. One detailed account traces the Dark Tower's closing to October of 1928, after just a single year of operation as a private club. Another source places the end of the townhouse's festive life 2 years later, in 1930, tying it directly to the onset of the Great Depression. The two accounts may simply be describing two different endings: the formal closure of the Dark Tower as a named venture, and the slower fade of the parties themselves, in the same rooms, under a different name or no name at all. Either way, something that had defined a decade did not survive it. What is not in dispute is the arithmetic underneath it. The Walker Company's own internal records, preserved in the family archive, show gross earnings of $275,937 in 1918, climbing to $595,353 by 1920, a business in genuinely strong health, only a decade before its collapse. The stock market crash of 1929 reversed that trajectory almost immediately. Sales that had climbed steadily for a decade began falling within months, and a company built on door-to-door sales to black women across the country, many of them now losing work themselves, had nowhere soft to land. Ransom, the same general manager who had kept the company running since Madam Walker's death, put the problem in writing with more honesty than anyone in the family seemed willing to say out loud. If they ever hoped to do anything for charity or for anyone else, he wrote, they needed to act before the Hudson River mansion deteriorated completely. It was, in effect, an admission that the house built to prove a family's arrival had quietly become a liability the family could no longer carry, a judgment from the one man who had spent over a decade reading the company's ledgers up close and never once appeared at a single party. The bookcase, shaped like a skyscraper, still stood in an empty room. The parties that once filled that room around it were already over, whichever year they actually ended. What came next would not be a slow fade, it would be an inventory list. In November of 1930, the auctioneers arrived at the Hudson River mansion. They catalogued Aubusson tapestries and rugs, lamps carved from jade and quartz, furniture chosen a decade earlier to answer the same question the mansion itself had been built to answer: whether a black family in America could own anything a white family could own. Pieces that had once anchored a card table where she played late into the night, or lit a hallway her guests crossed on their way to dance, were reduced now to lot numbers and estimated values, the kind of small specific arithmetic that turns a life into a spreadsheet. The New York Times covered the sale in detail, the kind of coverage a black family's finances rarely received unless something was being lost rather than gained. Room by room, the house that had once filled with music on a Saturday night was reduced to a list of lots and estimated values, priced the way any estate is priced once the people who filled it are no longer the point. By the following summer, in the depths of the Depression, an appraiser would value the entire 34-room property, house and grounds together, at $170,000, a fraction of the wealth it had once represented, and a small fraction of what its contents alone had cost to fill, back when the house had a reputation to protect rather than a debt to settle. The marriage came apart in the same stretch of time. She divorced her third husband, Dr. James Arthur Kennedy, the one man her biographer says she had actually trusted, sometime in 1931, just months before her death. Whether the divorce and the auction were connected in any direct way, the sources do not say. What they show is a woman losing, within the space of a single year, the house that carried her name and the husband she had wanted most. She did not retreat from social life entirely. In August of 1931, with the Depression tightening around nearly everyone she knew, she traveled to Long Branch, New Jersey, to celebrate a friend's birthday, a modest trip compared to the transatlantic crossings of a decade earlier, but a trip she made anyway, on her own terms, as she had made every other decision since 1919. Whatever anyone in Harlem still thought of her spending, of her marriages, of the parties that had come and gone, she had not stopped living the way she had chosen to live, even with the auction behind her, even with the divorce behind her, even with the country in the middle of collapsing around everyone she knew. The rugs were gone from the mansion by then. The lamps had new owners. What money remained still had room that summer for one more gathering, already marked down for the 17th. On the 17th of August, 1931, Alelia Walker spent her last afternoon at the beach in Long Branch, New Jersey, surrounded by 6 friends from Harlem, eating lobster and chocolate cake. They drank champagne, prohibition notwithstanding, and by every account there was a great deal of laughter, the same kind of laughter that had filled her rooms for a decade, only now it fit around a single table instead of a ballroom. Hours later, in a rented cottage near the water, she died of a cerebral hemorrhage, the same condition that had killed her mother 12 years earlier at 46 years old. She was laid out in a gown of gold lace and tulle over lavender satin, a pale green velvet sash at her waist, apple green satin slippers on her feet, and around her neck the strand of Chinese amber prayer beads she had worn for years, the same instinct for colour and staging that had once dressed 34 rooms in imported silk now applied, one final time, to a room she would never see. 3 orchids, a gift from a friend named Bessie Bearden, mother of the artist Ramar Bearden, were placed in her hands. The night before the service, the line outside the funeral home stretched into the dark, men and women waiting hours in the last heat of August for a few seconds beside an open casket. More than 11,000 people filed past her that night, a line that stretched down the block for hours, filled with people who had never once been invited through the door of Villa Lewaro or the Dark Tower, but had heard, for a decade, what happened inside them. It was, by any measure, one of the largest funerals Harlem had ever staged for one of its own, larger by far than the guest lists of any single party she had ever thrown. Roughly 1,000 people attended the funeral itself, by invitation only, filling a room built for grief the way her townhouse had once been filled for celebration. Mary McLeod Bethune delivered the eulogy, while the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr. presided. A quartet called the Bonbons opened the service with the hymn "Steal Away to Jesus." A singer named Paul Bass performed her favourite song from a recent Noel Coward play, and a columnist read aloud a poem Langston Hughes had written in the 2 days since her death. At Woodlawn Cemetery, as her casket was lowered into the ground beside her mother's, a man named Hubert Fauntleroy Julian, the first licensed black pilot in the world, flew a small plane low over the grave and dropped 2 bouquets of flowers onto the fresh earth below. One last extravagant gesture for a woman whose whole life had been judged, publicly, by exactly that kind of gesture. Langston Hughes, who had spent a decade at her parties and once called her the joy goddess of Harlem's 1920s, wrote afterward that her death marked the real end of the gay times of the new Negro era in Harlem. The Depression, he added, knocked everyone down a step or two, and black Americans had the fewest steps left to spare. He was not speaking only for himself. An entire circle of writers and artists who had built careers, partly on the access her rooms provided, lost, on the same August afternoon, both a friend and a kind of infrastructure no one else in Harlem had the means or the inclination to replace. The mansion outlived her by only a matter of months in any meaningful sense. Willed to the NAACP, it proved too costly for the organization to maintain, and in 1932 the estate sold it to a white fraternal benevolent society, which used it as a retirement home for decades. The same rooms that had once staged card games and late-night music now filled with folding chairs and quiet routine, while the company itself carried on without her. May took over the presidency and held it until her own death in 1945. Decades later, a descendant of that same adopted line, Alelia Bundles, would grow up to write the books that preserved most of what is known about the family today. One name passed down like a title nobody had ever formally inherited on paper, the way they inherited it in practice. By the 1980s, the mansion had fallen into serious disrepair, and developers began circling the property, hoping to clear it for condominiums. It survived only because 2 centuries-old trees on the grounds helped earn the site a place on the National Register of Historic Places, a technicality that saved a house nobody in the family could any longer afford to keep. In 1993, the mansion passed into the hands of a black investment banker and his wife, who spent the next quarter-century restoring it room by room before selling it on, in 2018, to new owners who still hold it today, protected by a preservation easement that keeps the house, whoever owns it next, from ever being altered beyond recognition again. The same system that decided a mother's money was earned and a daughter's spending was a disgrace never had to answer for what happens when both women end up buried in the same ground, within the same year of bookkeeping, mourned by the same 11,000 strangers who lined up in the August heat to see what was left. No one at that funeral home was checking a ledger. No one was asking whether the spending had been earned. No one, for one night, was applying the rule at all. Harlem, for one night in 1931, set the ledger aside and simply grieved. The house that almost vanished under the same judgment that followed her in life did not vanish after all. It stands today, on the Hudson River, in the hands of a family the ledger never expected to let keep it.